How's it going, everyone? It's Harvey from Weather Sponge 5000, and in this video, we're going to forecast the probability each state along the Atlantic coast could experience a landfalling hurricane this hurricane season, as we're going to take a look at several different factors, not just of how active the hurricane season will be, but the exact sort of trajectory or trend that of where tropical cyclones could move towards this hurricane season, because of course every hurricane season is different, and depending on what type of factors we're going to see during the hurricane season, we might see hurricanes go more towards a specific trajectory rather than potentially just going anywhere just randomly. So we're gonna take a look at factors to really determine that, to see the probability each state could experience a landfalling hurricane. So let's begin by first taking a look at the ENSO outlook. And as you can see in the previous ENSO outlook, it was leaning a little bit more to the idea that we were going to be in the neutral phase by the time we approach the more active months of the hurricane season, such as August and September. However, it seems like the probability of a La Nina is slowly rising, almost to a point where by the main months of the hurricane season, we're almost just as likely to receive a La Nina phase as much as a neutral phase during the main months of the hurricane season. So this could have big implications regarding how much tropical cyclones we could see in the Atlantic this hurricane season. Of course, typically during a La Nina, it's a lot more active than usual when it comes to tropical cyclone formation. El Nino patterns tend to bring less tropical cyclone development than usual over the Atlantic, while a neutral phase is right around the middle. However, we could see that phase, even if it's a neutral phase, lean a little bit more to the La Nina side, thanks to the fact that we're more likely to see, if we were to see a neutral phase, be on the colder side when it comes to the sea surf temperatures in the equatorial Pacific, which I believe will make it a little bit more conducive that we'll see more La Nina type conditions even during a neutral phase, rather than an El Nino, where the chance of the El Nino phase is rather low by the time we approach the main hurricane season months. So to give you guys a good idea of how much more active a La Nina pattern is when it comes to tropical cyclone formation compared to an El Nino, we clearly see over the past 30 years, there's been plenty more tropical cyclones that have formed in the Atlantic compared to an El Nino phase. And it's not only the amount of hurricanes that have developed in La Nina phases. What's also good to point out is the exact trajectories where we see these hurricanes move through during La Nina patterns. And with the La Nina, a clear trend we notice when it comes to where exactly hurricanes want to move towards is that they tend to move a lot further. They're more likely to move further westward during La Nina phases, and the reason is obvious. During a La Nina phase, we see less strong westerly wind shear, which allows the more tropical cyclones to be able to move further eastward westward without being deterred by the strong upper level winds induced by an El Nino pattern that would come from the west. During a La Nina phase, the westerly wind shear is very weak, which allows hurricanes to move a lot further westward. But during an El Nino phase, the opposite happens, which is the reason why we see most tropical cyclones stay well off the United States coast, with a few exceptions, of course. But a vast majority of the hurricanes that develop in El Nino patterns tend to stay a lot further eastward, away from the United States coast. So that's something interesting. We're going to be in a neutral phase, so we could expect a little bit somewhere in the middle, but I'd still lean a little bit more towards a La Nina type pattern this hurricane season, even if we're in a neutral phase. For several reasons. For one thing is that the sea surf temperatures are going to be warmer than normal, so even if we're in a neutral phase, the warmer sea surf temperatures should allow for a higher probability of tropical cyclone formation, so that will overall just raise the chance of a landfall even during a neutral phase. And another thing that's good to point out as well is that, like I said, we're almost just as likely to receive a La Nina phase about the main hurricane season months compared to a neutral phase, which means that even if we were in the neutral phase, I'd lean a little bit more to the idea that we'd be on the fringe of a La Nina phase where the sea surface temperatures are still slightly cooler than normal, which could allow for more La Nina type conditions than what you'd expect during a neutral phase. So I'd expect something a little bit closer to a La Nina type pattern when it comes to this hurricane season, which does increase the possibility of hurricane landfalls in the states further westward in the United States, such as the Gulf Coast states, and extending up along the Atlantic East Coast as well. Overall, just in general, there's a higher probability of landfall throughout the United States coast when we see La Nina type conditions. So definitely prepare for that. And like I just mentioned earlier, the sea surface temperatures are expected to be much warmer than normal this hurricane season, and they're currently more warmer than normal right now, where we do see a large swath of the Atlantic experiencing sea surface temperatures that are well above average for this time of the year. However, what's interesting that I think I should point out is right over the main development regions, surprisingly, we're seeing sea surface temperatures cooler than normal. So you might be thinking that maybe this could help limit the amount of tropical cyclones we see this hurricane season. However, we need to keep in mind that this patch of cooler than average sea surface temperatures is early on in the main development region. So even if a tropical cyclone were to struggle over this small area where the water temperatures are cooler than normal, it still has this second half of the main development region where it could easily re-strengthen. And we've seen plenty of times most tropical cyclones that come off the West African coast tend to strengthen a lot more towards the second half of the main development region once it's able to escape some of the dry Saharan dust that's just to the north of it, as well as the stronger wind shear that exists right just off the West African coast. Once it gets a little bit more independent in the second half of the main development region, the tropical cyclone, it tends to strengthen at a much more rapid pace. So unfortunately, I don't think that this cold patch you see right here will make necessarily a major difference when it comes to the amount of tropical cyclones you're expected to see this hurricane season. And it is forecasted by the climatological models that the warmer sea surface temperatures should eventually move towards this area. So I don't expect this cold patch to last very long based on the trend we're seeing from the computer model. So I do believe this will enhance the possibility of tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic this hurricane season. And as a direct result of that, we should be more likely all throughout the United States to receive a landfalling hurricane this hurricane season. So I mentioned this in my previous hurricane season video, but a good thing to take a look at is analog years. And what are analog years, you might be asking? Well, analog years are years that are very similar in terms of the type of conditions we're experiencing to what we're experiencing right now. So, but to give you an example, the 1996 hurricane season is setting up to be very similar to what we're experiencing right now, because during the 1996 hurricane season, we transitioned from a La Nina phase to a neutral phase by the time we approach a hurricane season of 1996, which would mean that, which is very similar to what we're experiencing right now, where during the winter time we were in a La Nina phase, but it's expected to transition into a neutral phase, and who knows, potentially back to a La Nina phase by the time we approach main hurricane season months. But at this point, the more likely scenario is that we'd be transitioning into a neutral phase by the main portion of the hurricane season. So the years that showed very similar conditions of what we're experiencing right now include the 1996 hurricane season, the 2001 hurricane season, and the 2012 hurricane season. And all three hurricane seasons happened during a positive Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, which is what we're in right now. So I think it's definitely best representative to take a look at these years to see the trends, not only when it comes to tropical cyclone activity, but where exactly these tropical cyclones move towards, because it might give us a good idea of the type of trend we'll see when it comes to the trajectory of tropical cyclones moving through the Atlantic. So here's a look at the 1996 hurricane season, where we saw an average amount of tropical cyclones develop. However, we see that most of these tropical cyclones stayed well to the west of the Gulf of Mexico, and we see that a lot of these tropical cyclones are moving right up along the east coast or just out to sea in general, which could indicate that more tropical cyclones will move closer to the Atlantic East Coast rather than impacting those right up along the Gulf Coast of the United States. So that's something to be aware of going into this hurricane season, and to at least take that into consideration. But we also need to take a look at the 2001 and 2012 hurricane seasons. So let's take a look at that. So the 2001 hurricane season was above average when it comes to the number of tropical cyclones that develop, but we see another common trend like we saw with the 1996 hurricane season. Virtually all the tropical cyclones stayed well to the east of the Gulf of Mexico, mainly staying out to sea, which again could indicate that we'd be more likely to see hurricanes that are further out to sea during a neutral phase that has transitioned from a La Nina phase a little bit earlier on during the winter. So that's something to keep in mind. And when we take a look at the 2012 hurricane season, we see a fairly similar scenario again, where really we only saw one hurricane move into the Gulf of Mexico, which was Hurricane Isaac back in August 2012, which made landfall as a Category 1 right up along the coast of Louisiana. But outside of that, virtually all the tropical cyclones stayed well out to sea, with the exception of Hurricane Sandy, which made landfall as an extratropical cyclone right up along the southern coast of New Jersey. But overall, more of these tropical cyclones during all three analog years stayed well to the east of the United States, which is making me more inclined to believe that while I do believe that the hurricane season will be above average, I think the probability of a landfall would be more simply above average right up along the Atlantic East Coast, while for the Gulf of Mexico, I think it might be closer to average based on what we're seeing with these three analog years, where the hurricane season is slightly above average, but much of these hurricanes stay well to the east of the United States, with some exceptions making landfall right up along the East Coast, which is the reason why up along the East Coast, I do expect it to be slightly above average when it comes to your probability of a hurricane landfall. So definitely keep that in mind. But we also need to take a look at other factors, which I'll show you right now. So taking a look at the climatological model, the CFS model, we see that during the main hurricane season months, the wind shear is expected to be much weaker all throughout the North Atlantic, which I believe will contribute to a much more active than usual hurricane season, which as a result will increase the probability of a hurricane landfall pretty much all throughout the East Coast, and even up along the Gulf Coast, even though it might be a little bit less likely that tropical cyclones would head that far west based on what we saw with the analog years. But still, when we're talking about an above average hurricane season, it will at least raise a decent amount for a hurricane landfall, even if prior analog years don't necessarily show that tropical cyclones move towards that direction during years that have very similar conditions of what we're experiencing right now. So keep that in mind going into the hurricane season, and taking a look at the 500 millibar height anomaly, the 3-month average. Another interesting thing that might be able to make it a little bit easier for a tropical cyclone to move into the Gulf of Mexico and impact the Gulf Coast is that the ridging is expected to be much stronger right over the northern Atlantic and into North America in general. So that could force a lot of tropical cyclones further westward than usual. But we need to take this with a grain of salt as well. It's very difficult to forecast months away, so we'll need to take it with a grain of salt. I'd still put a little bit more weight on the analog years, as well as the fact that we're going to be in the neutral phase, potentially close to La Nina, to determine the probability of a landfall right up along the United States. But it's definitely something to be aware of over the next few months regarding this ridge. If this continues to be this strong headed into the hurricane season, we could be in for hurricane season that brings tropical cyclones a little bit further westward. So definitely pay close attention to this computer model over the next few months. So when making this hurricane landfall probability forecast, I based it on the historical probability average, where in areas such as southern Florida, the coast of North Carolina, as well as southeast coast of Louisiana, you pretty much experience a landfalling hurricane once every 5 to 7 years. So it does happen relatively often, anywhere between a 20 to 15% chance, which is your average probability in any given year. So it's certainly fairly high in those areas, and then just outside of that, it's a little bit lower, but still a decent chance. So I base my forecast off of this probability, and we'll adjust this probability based on what we saw, where exactly tropical cyclones would be more likely to move towards, which, like we mentioned, would be the East Coast. And also we adjusted it based on just overall the tropical how active this hurricane season will be. Since it's expected to be above average, we should expect the probabilities to be higher compared to average for a lot of these states. So here's the probability of a hurricane making landfall within 50 miles of each location, of course based on the map I've just showed you. So right up along the southern coast of Texas, it should be only a 5% chance. In any given year, it's fairly rare for this area to receive a landfalling hurricane, as like I said, many hurricanes tend to make landfall further eastward before they're able to reach this area of Texas. So a 5% chance is around average, because I do believe the analog years are showing that tropical cyclones tend to move a little bit further eastward during years that have very similar conditions to this one. So it might be a little bit tougher for a hurricane to make it this far west. However, I think that the more active than usual hurricane season will sort of balance that balance it out compared to a lesser probability of a hurricane moving this far westward. So I do believe the percentages should remain around average, right, for the southern coast of Texas and even the northern coast of Texas, where the landfall probability is around 10% chance. For the southeastern coast of Louisiana, again, right around average, 15% chance. 10% chance all throughout the Gulf Coast of Florida. Let me move my head out of the way so I can show you guys exactly what I'm talking about. So for the southern coast of Florida, you might not be able to see it, but it's a 25% chance of a landfall this hurricane season. So that's slightly above average, because I do believe that the east coast of the United States will have a higher probability this hurricane season, with a more active than usual hurricane season, and analog years showing a trend where hurricanes do have a higher probability of making landfall right up along this coast. So definitely keep that in mind. Just north of that, 15% chance for the Georgia coast, as well as much as South Carolina. 20% chance for the coast of North Carolina, slightly above average for you guys. 10% chance all throughout the northeast coast, which is, again, slightly above average. Still a low chance, but slightly above average. And then 5% chance pretty much from Boston northward, where in any given year it's fairly rare to receive a landfalling hurricane. So definitely keep that in mind. Right up along the east coast, the chance should be higher for a hurricane making landfall within a 50-mile radius. So definitely be prepared this hurricane season. Take those forecasts with a grain of salt. This is a long-term forecast, but you want to make sure to prepare. And remember, whether it's a more active than usual hurricane season or less active than usual hurricane season, you don't want to underestimate the hurricane season, because remember, all it takes is one devastating hurricane to completely change the lives of millions of people. So you never want to underestimate a potential tropical cyclone, just because this hurricane season hasn't been as active as you expected. So make sure to prepare accordingly in a lot of these areas. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.